this was really an eventful week in Congress. Frankly, it's the last week before the 6-week August break, and it was full of drama and, frankly, some unexpected and welcome signs of bipartisanship. On the drama front, undoubtedly the Mueller hearing was the most impactful and probably the most covered event. We don't have any Oklahomans that actually sit on Judiciary Committee or the Intelligence Committee in the House where those two hearings were held. So as a delegation, we were mostly catching glimpses of it, reading the coverage. I will just tell you my impression was pretty much what I thought it was going to be. That is, Mueller had told us earlier he was going to stay within the parameters of the report, which meant there probably wasn't going to be anything dramatic. I don't think there really was. Honestly, if you thought the president had done something impeachable, you probably still thought that after the hearing. If you thought that he had not, and that he'd been the victim of an unwarranted special prosecutor's activity, then you probably still thought that. I just don't think very many minds were changed by it, and I think it, in that sense, was a political non-event. Interesting to watch, but and I thought everybody, frankly, handled themselves pretty well, the members, but I don't think it was a dramatic performance, and I think Mr. Mueller told us it wasn't going to be a dramatic performance. So people just need to read the report, draw their own conclusions. Probably in the work I did, it didn't get nearly as much coverage because it was on the same day as the Mueller hearing. But we had a really important hearing on the treatment and the policies of unaccompanied minors that are crossing our borders by the thousands in the Labor, Health, and Human Service and Education Subcommittee. I think they thought it was going to be a little more dramatic than it was because it was set in the largest hearing room that the Appropriations Committee has. The idea there'd be a lot of press there. Frankly, all the press was down at the Mueller hearing, and that's fine. But we had actually a very serious discussion, 3 panels, individual members who had gone and visited many of these centers, a second panel of administration officials that were responsible for handling the unaccompanied minor crisis at the border, and then finally some advocate groups that have an interest here and have been making comments. So you had quite a variety of points of view. But I think there was some good news there. Frankly, we now know the flow has been reduced. That's partly a matter of the weather. It's also partly a matter of the Mexicans stepping up and providing more security, and we think the word may be getting out that this is a difficult process and maybe fewer people out of these northern triangle countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras are coming. But that could change. You just don't know. A second piece of good news, more beds are online. So we're putting people not in what are called influx overflow facilities, things like we would have at Fort Sill, but literally in much more supervised, much smaller settings where there's adequate education, medical care, security, what have you. And so that, I thought that was good news. The administration's actually bringing on more beds and has more plans. I actually had a private meeting with the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Azar, with 2 other members, and we had a long discussion about this as well. Third, probably, this is something we're going to have to think about because we're going to continue to see these. The analogy I use, they're sort of like hurricanes. You don't know when they're coming, but you better be planned and ready for them because they're going to happen occasionally. We had one in 2014, now we've had this one this year. It could happen at any given time. Part of this is because cartels who are facilitating this traffic don't tell us, obviously, we're bringing a lot of people in next month. So we're going to have to be a little more thoughtful about what kind of capacity we maintain and are able to mobilize in a very short order. Finally, and this got lost in the hearings, things got better because Congress finally gave the administration the money it asked for a couple of weeks ago. In 2014, when the Obama administration had the same problem, it asked for emergency funding. It got that funding within 24 days after Congress looked through and determined, yes, there was a crisis. It took 58 days this time, and a lot of the backup that we saw in the border stations, a lot of the overflow was because Congress was not providing the resources, and the Department of Health and Human Services literally exhausted every dollar that they had, every transfer authority that they had. They were starting to have to cut back services, and they could not take kids from the Border Patrol We all agree you don't want to hold people at Border Patrol stations. They're just simply not set up for it. That's not what they're there to do. They're there to protect the border, not house people that have come across illegally. That's a Health and Human Services function for minors, and we're doing a much better job. You'll also be happy to know that the average stay at one of these facilities has dropped from 90 days down to about 42 now. It just tells me we're placing people and processing better. We still have a real problem at the border, no doubt about it. We still have a security issue here. But I think the administration, once given the funds, has done a much better job of getting on top of it. Two pieces of legislation that were the last two passed of the week were actually remarkably bipartisan for what's been a very partisan and polarized Congress. The first one was something you probably didn't hear about. It's called the Venezuelan TPA, TPA. It's basically a matter of making it legal for refugees from Venezuela to come into the United States. If you follow the news, you know Venezuela has a socialist government. It's in the middle of an economic meltdown. There's a political struggle going on, a lot of persecution. These are legitimate political refugees, very much in the same way in an earlier era that Vietnamese Americans were political refugees or Cubans were political refugees from the Castro regime. This just simply authorizes us to receive these folks, most of whom, by the way, are middle class, have a lot of skills, certainly didn't want to come here. They're literally fleeing persecution in their own countries. So Congress in a bipartisan act said to this particular population, we won't put limitations on immigration. There are literally millions of Venezuelan refugees, most of them, by the way, not coming to the United States. Most of them are going into neighboring countries where they can get back home if the political situation stabilizes, where they know the language, in many cases where they have relatives. But there are certainly a number that have friends and family here, would like to seek sanctuary in the United States. Personally, I think that's the right thing to do when people are fleeing from political persecution. The last thing, and by far the most consequential thing Congress did this week, was a 2-year budget agreement negotiated by the president with Speaker Pelosi, with the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, also with the two minority leaders, that would be Senator Chuck Schumer in the Senate and Kevin McCarthy. So this was a really bipartisan negotiation. And that means everybody had to give something up. We're in divided government. Nobody got everything they want, certainly myself included. But the things that did happen were really good. Number one, we were facing a potential debt crisis. That is the suspension of the borrowing authority of the United States. Could have happened in September. That's now been pushed off past the next election, so it won't be subject to political manipulation and crisis. That restores confidence in the markets. It's actually very important for the long-term continued economic prosperity and growth of the United States. The second thing that we did was come up with a 2-year budget deal, how much we're going to spend. Now, there's a lot of spin out there, if you will, about what this really means. Basically, we're not increasing spending by very much over the next 2 years. We haven't over the last 8 in terms of either defense or non-defense. As a matter of fact, if you adjust it for inflation, even with these increases, we're spending 17% less than we were in 2010 on defense and overseas military operations. We're spending about 4% or 5% less than we were on non-defense things. The total expansion of the budget has been on things like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. That's 60% of all federal spending. There's been no reforms, no effort to either provide additional revenue or do some things that would save money over time. That's where the real spending is. As a matter of fact, my friend Steve Womack from Arkansas, if you have a chance, I would recommend you listen to his debate on the bill. He got up and showed in the last 10 years for defense and non-defense spending, total spending has gone from about 1.2 to about 1.3 trillion dollars. $100 billion is a lot of money, but over 10 years, it's not much of an increase. As a matter of fact, it's not even inflation. Whereas in the same time period, the increase for entitlement spending, that's again primarily Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, had gone from about $2.1 trillion to 3.2 or $3 trillion. So in other words, enormous increase, 10-to-1 increase in entitlement spending. So until Congress gets serious about that, we won't get there. Last point to make about this budget deal, and very important, is that we're in a rebuild of the American military. And this gives the military 2 years of certainty as to how much money they're going to have. They'll have it on time. They'll be able to plan, rebuild. This is something that we began 2 years ago. It's going to take about 5 years. This gets the next 2 years of it done. And to a district that has Fort Sill and Tinker Air Force Base in, very, very important. But frankly, to every American, having a secure military, well-funded and able to operate and rebuilding and repairing itself after many, many years of war, we live in a dangerous world and we need a military capable of it. So I looked at it and certainly supported it. The Oklahoma delegation split on it 3-2. But that's okay. I understand our senators may split 1-1, but I think if your emphasis is the military, economic stability, and security, and frankly restraining spending while avoiding government shutdowns, this was the right vote to cast. Anyway, this is my last report on what we're doing in Congress for a few weeks because Congress will be out. But I'll be in the district. We have a number of town halls coming up. We're publicizing those. Would very much appreciate it if any of you care to come out. That you do. If you've got some questions, we're more than happy to answer them. If you can't make one of the town halls, we'll actually be doing a teletown hall too. So you can either dial into that, or if you give us your number, we will make sure that you're included on that call. But anyway, I'll be all across the district the next 6 weeks. Look forward to talking to everybody after what's been a very eventful, very controversial Congress, but it ended with a pretty good week.